Hello, everybody. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, Mianjin. And I'd like to emphasize that this land was never ceded, but rather taken. On behalf of everyone here and the institution for which I work, the University of Queensland, I would like to pay respect to the Turrbal and Juggerah peoples, their ancestors and their descendants, and their enduring cultural and spiritual connections to country. We stand with them in solidarity and acknowledge the complicity of institutions like the university in ongoing processes of dispossession. I'd also like to extend that collective acknowledgement and solidarity to the traditional owners and custodians of the various lands from which you and our speakers join us today. Welcome to the second lecture in the 2024 People, Plants and the Law online lecture series. One of the aims of the series is to bring together personal historical reflections from a group of the most important figures working on people, plants, and the law over the last 40 years. Another aim is to showcase some of the best work happening currently in the area. We've been running for 3 years now, and you can find recordings of previous year's lectures, along with recordings of all of this year's lectures on the series website. If you have any questions for our speaker, please post them in the comments section, and we'll do our best to get to some of them after the talk. So in today's lecture, we're once again showcasing some of the most exciting work currently being undertaken, but this time from two of the longest standing scholars working on people, plants, and the law. Our speakers today are the Bioeconomy Chair and Professor in the Department of Environmental and Geographical Sciences, Professor Rachel Wynberg, and Dr. Sarah Laird at the University of Kent and co-director of People and Plants International. I'm not sure I can say anything useful in just a couple of minutes, looking over the long run of two such significant bodies of work. Our speaker's work stretches through over 20 years of detailed analyses of ethnobiology, non-timber forest products, access and benefit sharing, conservation and biodiversity, local foodways, agroecology, and policy. In preparation for this talk, I picked up an open access copy of Professor Wynberg's 2024 edited collection, African Perspectives on Agroecology, Why Farmer-Led Seed and Knowledge Systems Matter. And you should download one too, available on the Practical Action website. Alongside their academic work, our speakers are both involved in a huge number of projects and initiatives, and I would especially encourage you to look at the websites of People and Plants International, the University of Cape Town's Bioeconomy Chair, and the Rethinking Biodiversity-based Economies project. One thing that runs through their work, and I think I can pick this out with being too reductive, is a commitment to policies and processes that advance social justice and conservation. That commitment means understanding those policies and processes, but also improving them. I think the following quote from a 2020 Science article, which our speakers co-authored alongside a number of other academics, is emblematic of that concern. And to quote, "This is a critical juncture. In the coming years, important meetings will be held in policy forums and decisions will be made on digital sequence information and access and benefit sharing that will have impacts for years to come. In many cases, the implications of these decisions have not been fully explored. In the face of rapid scientific and technological advances and equally swift and alarming biodiversity loss, it is time to get ABS policy right." So it's my great pleasure to hand over to Dr. Laird, who joins us in the substance of the paper, but not in person as it is in the middle of the night for her, and Professor Wynberg, who will be speaking today on rethinking biodiversity-based economies for conservation, for justice and conservation. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you so much, Beres, for those very kind words, and good morning, afternoon and evening to everybody. And many thanks to the University of Queensland Law School for the very kind information invitation to participate in this wonderful series that they've curated over the past 3 years, and especially to you, Beres, for your enthusiasm and your support in making this happen. So it's quite a tall order. Sorry, I'm just trying to get my slides working. There we go. It's quite a tall order to speak about the last sort of 30 plus years of access and benefit sharing. And Sarah and I spent some time discussing what to focus on as part of our current and research and policy work on rethinking access and benefit sharing and biodiversity-based economies. Should we talk about whether a mechanism that was created in an era when we didn't even have mobile phones and in the earliest days of the biotech revolution can ever be fit for purpose in today's fast-changing world? Or how a policy framework that has never been fully conceived and implemented recently infiltrated a wide range of international multilateral agreements, ranging from health through to intellectual property, agriculture, and the high seas. Should we discuss how access and benefit sharing implementation, known as ABS, has been almost impossible in many countries, overwhelmed by a multitude of laws and bureaucratic procedures that almost obsessively focus on compliance? Should we even begin to enter the fray of how best to regulate and deliver funding arising from the use of so-called digital sequence information, or DSI? Of more concern and perhaps even more impact are the scientific collaborations and technology transfers between the global North and South that ABS has yet to deliver. Where do they fit in within current DSI discussions? DSI itself as the subject of environmental policy, a term that has evolved in negotiating spaces to refer to the way in which genetic sequence data is stored, used, and managed, raises as many questions as it answers. Pulling the lens wider to include biotrade, where are the benefits for conservation that we were told market-based approaches would yield? Or the benefits for and impacts on local stewards of biodiversity and those holding traditional knowledge about the rapidly dwindling life on our planet? So as you can see, there's no shortage of topics that need a rethink in today's policy arena. But today we thought a useful place to start is at the beginning of ABS policy formulation, especially for those who may not be familiar with its origins. So once we've talked about the history, we'll look at the rationale behind ABS, the growing rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, how ABS and conservation have shifted over the years. We'll have a brief look at DSI and its policy implications, explore intersections of ABS and conservation, and then look at some of the challenges of ABS implementation at a national level, with a deeper look at experiences from my country, South Africa, and a few iconic cases that bring to light critical questions about the ABS approach. We'll then close by suggesting a few ways forward and introduce you to the program that we are developing on rethinking ABS and biodiversity-based economies. So let's take you back to 1992, a time of great excitement and hope, with a suite of new agreements negotiated at the Rio Earth Summit, not only the Convention on Biodiversity, the CBD, but also conventions on climate change and desertification. I was an eager postgraduate student at the time, one of only 5 South Africans at the summit, doing my master's dissertation on implications of the summit for South Africa, which was still a pariah state and not yet a member of the United Nations. Sarah worked for the NGO, the Rainforest Alliance, and ran a program that looked at ethical and sustainability issues associated with medicinal plant use and commercialization. She also attended the Earth Summit, although we didn't know each other then, and was working on a book with a range of partners exploring the legal and policy context of what they referred to then as biodiversity prospecting, a term that has since fallen out of favor. The field of conservation was transforming at the time the CBD was negotiated, moving away from a preservationist approach to one intended to produce greater equity and sustainability, as well as responsiveness to Indigenous and local communities. In part, this shift resulted from the increasingly evident environmental and health costs of economic growth, particularly in industrialized countries, as well as growing awareness that the world's biodiversity and intact natural environments were often found in inverse proportion to technological and industrial wealth. But if the Global South was to shoulder responsibility for conservation, redress was needed for the centuries-long history of colonialism, and prior to that, the expansion of imperial empires, due primarily to the extraction of natural resources and traditional knowledge from the Global South. So growing from these experiences and the increasing adoption of intellectual property rights for living organisms, there were serious concerns that lucrative pharmaceutical, biotech, agricultural, and food industries would benefit from the commercial exploitation of traditional knowledge and biodiversity without adequately recognizing or compensating knowledge holders and biodiversity custodians. In what's often been described as the Grand Bargain, the CBD and later its Nagoya Protocol thus set in place a new regime to regulate bioprospecting and trade in genetic resources and traditional knowledge, also known as access and benefit sharing, or ABS. Promising to redress inequities in the trade of natural products and provide economic incentives for conservation, this regime obliged signatory countries to obtain permission before collecting genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. And these measures required countries to mutually agree on the terms of exchange and to share benefits fairly and equitably with local providers and countries. In doing so, the three objectives of the CBD, conservation, sustainable use, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from genetic resources, reflected a new way of thinking about conservation, sustainability, and equity. So the CBD also responded to a growing movement to assert the cultural and environmental rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, known in international parlance as IPLCs, with increased recognition that IPLCs are custodians of much of the world's biodiversity and that conservation and sustainable use in their territories is integral to the way of life for many. International policy instruments addressed in increasingly clearer terms the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities to consult, consent, control, and benefit from the use of their land, resources, and knowledge, and these included the International Labour Organization Convention 169 concerning Indigenous peoples in 1989, and in later years the 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the 2018 UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, or UNDROP. Within the CBD, Article 8J was a dramatic step forward for an environmental treaty, committing parties to respect, preserve, and maintain the biodiversity-based knowledge, innovations, and practices of Indigenous and local communities. And the recent adoption by member states of WIPO of the Treaty on Intellectual Property, Genetic Resources, and Associated Traditional Knowledge further cements these commitments, aiming to enhance the efficacy, transparency, and quality of the patent system with regard to genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge, and to prevent related patents from being granted erroneously for inventions that are not novel or inventive. So ABS has moved in multiple directions since the CBD entered into force 30 years ago, but this was always, in some ways, even misguided or delayed, a response to rapid advances in science and technology, with the intent to generate revenues in high biodiversity countries for conservation from the commercial use of genetic and biological resources in varied industries. From an early focus on natural products, pharmaceuticals, and agriculture, shifting in part to biotrade under the Nagoya Protocol, and now the relatively recent focus on DSI, ABS has tried to anticipate a range of interwoven issues so multifaceted and complex, and always changing, that it was destined to face implementation challenges. And this slide captures some of these key trends, demonstrating the dramatic technological changes since adoption of the CBD 30 years ago, with a biorevolution in the use of biotech, synthetic biology, genomics, bioinformatics, a dramatic increase in the use of microbes, and with increased reliance on DSI, new forms of using and commercializing biodiversity. So while the first 10 years of ABS in the 1990s witnessed some promising developments with a focus on research partnerships, a concerted effort to emphasize the scientific capacity building and tech transfer benefits, and a focus on conservation, it didn't yield much in the way of benefits for communities. Growing pressures to deliver concrete economic benefits and strengthen ABS implementation thus saw the 2000s and the Nagoya Protocol policy process create a hiatus as policymaking ran headlong into the parallel world of raw commodity bulk trade and niche, relatively small-scale partnerships between communities and companies. So the policy framework thus moved away from the original focus of ABS on high-tech research within pharmaceutical, biotech, ag, and other industries, but leading to much ado about very little in that realm, due to the realization that actually many raw material sectors already have mechanisms in place to promote sustainability and equity, such as certification, standards, company partnerships, in some countries, laws. Moreover, in some cases, natural product industries are so firmly entrenched through monopoly control, trade protection, and intellectual property rights that ABS can do very little to leverage the fundamental and systematic economic changes that are required to achieve equity. And here we are now, focused back on DSI, with ABS coming full circle to the high-tech sectors and to science. So what is DSI and why all the fuss? In a nutshell, advances in technology now allow the rapid sequencing and sharing of genetic data extracted from plants, animals, and microbes from all over the world. This information is stored in open access or open source international databases, and it's available for anyone to use, including companies who use this data to create commercial products. While there's wide agreement that these databases are vital for both basic and applied research, there are concerns that new forms of so-called digital piracy have emerged, which are disassociated from the physical material itself and traditional knowledge holders with no clear sites for getting prior informed consent or sharing benefits. Countries with rich biodiversity, particularly in the global south, have thus raised concerns that their genetic resources are being used and in some cases monetized and commercialized without approval or fair compensation, and IPLCs have similar concerns. So as you can see from the flurry of media around the topic, with all these articles appearing in just the last few weeks, many are now pinning their hope on DSI being able to leverage some of the funding required to support conservation and IPLCs. So just a few weeks ago, DSI took center stage at the 16th Conference of Parties to the CBD in Cali, Colombia, where a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism was established with the newly set up Cali Fund to be used for the collection and disbursement of monetary benefits arising from the use of DSI. This is a voluntary mechanism requiring commercial users of DSI to contribute a proportion of their profits or revenue to the Global Fund according to their size. Use for academic or non-commercial purposes, however, carries no charge. While this decision signals important progress, questions have been raised about the great deal of time, money, and effort that has gone into dealing with DSI, the effectiveness of the strategy, and the need for better due diligence before embarking on a new era of policy formulation. If funds are eventually secured from this voluntary mechanism, the complexities of their distribution and the poor track record of global funds in the past will need very careful interrogation. Although current ABS policy discussions are covering new ground, including DSI, it's still early days to say where this will end up. It's safe to say, however, that like all laws and policies, any new measures will be most effective when grounded in scientific, cultural, ecological, and economic contexts and realities. This includes addressing structural, institutional, and power inequities, and the primary causes of biodiversity loss and inequitable scientific and commercial practices. As we know too well, biodiversity loss since the CBD entered into force has been staggering, and it's now considered, alongside climate change, as an existential crisis of our time. The IPBES Global Biodiversity Assessment Report was sobering. global species extinction accelerating at the highest rate in 10 million years, 75% of terrestrial and 66% of marine environments severely altered, and more than 85% of wetlands present in 1700 lost by 2000. And things have only become worse since that report was published in 2019, exacerbated by climate change and habitat destruction. At the same time, industries destructive to biodiversity and the rights of IPLCs dwarf in scale the spending on conservation and remain very poorly regulated. In an era of growing finance complexity, including proposals for biodiversity credits, we have to ask whether simply stopping these destructive activities may be a far more effective approach for conservation and community rights than trying to develop convoluted and risky mechanisms to raise funding for conservation. What is clear is that our efforts to develop ABS laws that are relevant and can be implemented, that create economic incentives for conservation and equity through biodiversity commercialization, and that strengthen the rights of IPLCs have been largely unsuccessful. Work Sarah and I did a few years ago, interviewing over 100 people across all spheres of ABS and analyzing multiple ABS agreements, revealed how little had been achieved by ABS in delivering on the CBD conservation goals. What laws have been developed are rarely effectively implemented. The few analyses of the impacts of ABS measures demonstrate few or problematic economic and scientific benefits, and the enormous policy apparatus that has surrounded ABS in the last 3 decades has surely consumed far more resources than the policies have yielded for conservation, IPLCs, and equity in science. The reasons are due to multiple interconnecting factors, including the tendency for governments to prioritize economic development over biodiversity conservation, a lack of interest in ABS implementation in many high biodiversity countries when donor support dries up, laws and policies which don't adequately embed conservation and equity in ABS agreements and lead to confusion about the activities they are intended to regulate, and insufficient interest on the part of industry to go further. There's also insufficient recognition of local communities as biodiversity custodians, which is exacerbated by laws and ABS agreements that separate traditional knowledge and biological resources. Opportunities exist for ABS agreements and approaches to strengthen land tenure and resource rights, and to support customary practices that strengthen conservation and sustainable use, but this has seldom, if ever, occurred. What's very clear is that the market-driven assumptions behind ABS need urgent new thinking. ABS originated at a time when conservation was increasingly interwoven with sustainable development and became part of the political economy and the privatization of biodiversity ownership. Conservation strategies, including ABS, moved towards neoliberal market-based approaches with a view of nature as capital, selling nature to save it, within a pro-growth paradigm that placed the market, economic incentives, and improved livelihoods at the center of conservation strategies. However, the emphasis on incentives for sustainable and equitable business practices, corporate partnerships, win-win scenarios for communities, companies, and the economy, ESG investment, and other so-called carrots, has had limited or no impact on conservation, equity, and social justice related to the use of biodiversity. And as the former UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights has described, a large part of the problem is the misplaced faith in the market and private sector to solve environmental and social ills. So if conservation hasn't emerged from 30 years of implementation, what has? Due in part to the fact that 141 countries have ratified the Nagoya Protocol and thus have obligations to give effect to it through national laws, a substantial body of ABS law and policy is now in place in multiple countries across the world, including an estimated 294 laws, admin, and policy measures. The nature of these laws and policies is varied, ranging from framework laws for biodiversity that incorporate some ABS provisions through to ABS laws and regulations that set in place very specific processes for accessing biodiversity, negotiating agreements, and distributing benefits. So we don't have time to go into the detail of these different approaches and experiences at national level, Safe to say that the results from ABS policy implementation have been mixed at best. There's a mountain of literature now on the effectiveness of different approaches, much of it concluding that we still have some way to go due to lengthy and complex ABS measures, limited political will, poor coordination between government departments, limited monitoring, legal and social uncertainties, and the list goes on. However, a substantial amount of funding through donors such as GIZ and institutions such as UNDP, UNEP, and the GEF has been invested in supporting countries in the Global South to develop ABS laws and build the capacity to implement them, including through negotiating agreements, investing in community protocols, setting up trade partnerships, developing guidelines, and a myriad of other important approaches. Sarah and I have been part of this enormous effort for a number of decades to help try and make ABS work. Moving away from the global context, I'd like to dwell a bit on South Africa, which is often cited as one of the countries with the most extensive experience in implementing ABS, based to some extent on the phenomenal biodiversity and cultural diversity that we have, but also the history of exploitation and thus the need for redress. And now also a strong political intent to see bioprospecting and the biodiversity-based economy as economic strategies through Operation Pakisa, which means hurry up in Sesotho, one of our local languages. As a result, we have a highly developed, complex, and wide-ranging ABS policy space involving multiple laws and several government departments, often creating a very confusing and at times very cumbersome regulatory environment. A central requirement is for benefit-sharing agreements to be in place before permits are issued, and to date dozens of these agreements have been negotiated and more than 130 permits issued. Unusually, South Africa also regulates biotrade, meaning trade in all indigenous biological resources rather than bioprospecting based on genetic resources, which is, of course, a much narrower scope, although the lines between the two are often quite fuzzy. To understand some of the implementation challenges linked to ABS, I thought it useful to explore in more depth two cases from South Africa that have gone through the ABS hoops. The now well-known so-called gold standard benefit-sharing agreement negotiated between the rooibos industry and representatives from some indigenous San and Khoi organizations, and a series of agreements and approaches for benefit sharing centered on the plant Pelargonium pseudoides. There are many more examples, but they all reveal very similar patterns, so I will use these two to be illustrative. So some of you may know this delicious tea, rooibos, that is unique to South Africa, and which represents an industry that's more than 100 years old and is one of the most successful indigenous natural products that has emerged from the country. The darker side of the rooibos industry is its location in the country's colonial and apartheid history, like many other plants, and the dispossession of indigenous San and Khoi from rooibos growing landscapes centuries ago. Today, the marginalization persists through the legacy of apartheid policies, which excluded so-called colored farmers from the government support and subsidy schemes designed for white rooibos farmers. Inequality continues to characterize the industry, with white farmers cultivating about 93% of all rooibos tea lands today. In about 2010, two indigenous San and Khoi organizations demanded that the rooibos industry recognize their role as primary knowledge holders of the plant, confirmed by a government report, and negotiations began to develop a benefit-sharing agreement facilitated by the National Department of Environment Affairs. 9 years later, the agreement was signed, requiring a 1.5% levy of farm gate price to be paid in equal parts to the South African Sand Council and the National Khoi Sand Council. In 2022, the first payments were made, equating to about 12 million rands, which is about 700,000 US dollars. And there have been further payments since then. So this picture shows the signing of the benefit-sharing agreement with our then Minister of Environment Affairs, Barbara Creasy, and representatives from the rooibos industry and the Sand Council and National Khoi Sand Council. This is indeed a big victory. Traditional knowledge holders upon which the industry was founded have been recognized and some kind of reparation has been paid. but it also raises many questions. For example, colonial persecution continuing through apartheid policies meant that knowledge of rooibos was largely lost by Indigenous San and Khoi, who were moved thousands of kilometers away. Yet rooibos knowledge was retained by the small-scale rooibos farmers and farm workers who remained. These mixed-race descendants of European settlers, former slaves, and Khoi and San don't necessarily identify as Indigenous, but have contributed in significant ways to the rooibos industry. Under the current ABS agreement, government-recognized San and Khoi organizations are sole beneficiaries. Yet small-scale colored farmers and farm workers, many of whom are landless and unemployed, were largely left out of the negotiating process and eventually only included if they're affiliated with the National Khoisan Council. As you can see in this diagram, they will receive only a fraction of funding, some 5% of benefits arising from the agreement. Moreover, in a bureaucratic twist, these same small-scale farmers are now required to pay the 1.5% levy to San and Khoi organizations, leading to a great deal of conflict. Moreover, there are multiple other organizations who represent Indigenous San and Khoi who considered themselves excluded from the process. So there's a quote here: "We never heard anything until we saw the signed agreement on national television from an organization that was not part of the negotiations." And there are others who are resentful about the forced and implied requirements to self-identify as Khoi in order to claim benefits, with a quote here from a small-scale rooibos farmer who said, "I was told that the Hayveld, which is one of the local tea cooperatives, and the South Bokafel communities were removed from the negotiations because they found out that we aren't 100% Khoisan." As you can see, this starts leading us into a very messy and complex domain about who is included and excluded and who decides. In another example, the plant Pelargonium pseudoides is widely used as a traditional medicine, with traditional knowledge held across South Africa and Lesotho. It's also a commercial remedy to treat bronchitis that has a history of biopiracy charges led by NGOs and the eventual revoking of related patents by German pharmaceutical company Schwabe. The plant occurs mostly in communal areas, and it involves several hundred harvesters for whom it comprises an important income. In addition to harvesting permits for Pelargonium, South Africa's Biodiversity Act also requires two types of benefit-sharing agreements: one to access the resource, which typically involves undisclosed monetary benefits to chiefs and traditional leadership based on a price per kilogram, and another to access associated traditional knowledge, linked at the moment to the Khachabi Kingdom, which has positioned itself as the supreme authority over 42 traditional councils in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, and has declared itself to be the original traditional knowledge holder of Pelargonium pseudoides, despite the knowledge being widespread across many parts of South Africa and Lesotho. The case is complex, and I won't go into details other than to say that it raises concerns both about the vulnerability of harvesters and resource providers in negotiating an equitable price, negotiating mutually agreed terms, making collective decisions about how benefits that accrue from use of the resource should be shared at a community level, and what these benefits should comprise, as well as those relating to the way in which traditional knowledge holders have claimed priority over the plant. So Chris Morris has just published a brilliant book, Biotraffic, which I illustrate here, about the case, and I urge you to read it, as it encapsulates so much of how ABS governance can go awry at a community level. He describes how ABS has fostered business partnerships between South African traditional leaders and multinational pharmaceutical companies, and has led to a situation where ABS rights are currently instruments of tribal subjectification, and thus an important mode of accumulation for traditional leaders. Combined, these cases reflect some important achievements through a significant flow of financial benefits and important recognition of historical injustices. But if we dig a bit deeper, multiple questions are raised about the extent of these agreements achieving equity and conservation, with some possibly even entrenching inequity among marginalized communities, for example, through excluding resource custodians, as in rooibos, or recognizing only some but not other traditional knowledge holders, as in Pelargonium. Moreover, a business-as-usual approach prevails that neither transfers power nor enables a community-based or owned approach to commercialization. Traditional knowledge holders and resource custodians continue to be raw material suppliers, with ownership remaining highly skewed towards industry partners and the monopolization of markets through cultivation, intellectual property, and land ownership. These cases and many others also show how equity is concerned as much with the outcome of negotiations as it is with the process that's developed to get there. An important question to ask is therefore what pre-existing conditions restrict or enable people's access to decision-making processes, resources, and therefore benefits. ABS, as currently conceptualized, obliges governments, in this case South Africa, but the argument could be made much more widely, to adopt an approach whereby those seeking permits must negotiate with an organized legal entity and agree on a benefit-sharing outcome that is mutually acceptable. In doing so, the assumption is made that communities are sufficiently organized and capacitated to develop a legal standing and that those are represented are the legitimate claimants. While recognizing and rewarding traditional knowledge is clearly critical and necessary, these experiences suggest that proving origin may favor holders of traditional knowledge or genetic resources who are politically connected, who are well organized and resourced, and who are more visible. In the process, others who are less capacitated or connected may be excluded, despite having equally valid claims. The marginalization of certain communities and groups may thus be entrenched in the process. So, in drawing this all together, how can we think anew about biodiversity-based economies for conservation and equity? There are growing concerns about the calcification of the ABS framework and increasing recognition of its limitations for achieving real social, economic, and environmental impact. Right now, we see it as much more of a compliance framework than anything else, although there is potential to make it work better. Importantly, it's only one mechanism among many others, and we need to give attention also to other approaches to achieve conservation and justice. ABS can't stand alone. We need to give serious attention to inequalities in value chains, to moving away from raw material supply from the global south, giving producers a living wage, embedding ownership in enterprises. We also need to give attention to the ways in which agreements bring in traditional knowledge holders and think anew about different approaches to recognize, strengthen, and respect traditional knowledge. And finally, we need to locate biodiversity-based economies in the context of wider landscapes that may involve far more destructive industries, and ask questions about broader strategies to restore, regenerate, and conserve biodiversity, and how biodiversity-based economies working together with biodiversity custodians can support more coherent approaches to enable mutually thriving systems. These reflections among ourselves and many other colleagues have helped spur the development of what we call the Rethinking program. The Rethinking program was designed to create a process in which, outside of direct and immediate policy applications, but as a precursor to future policy efforts, we can collectively take a step back and more critically examine on a fundamental level what has worked, what has not, what we've learned, and what at the end are our true objectives. It builds on the contributions of all of us who worked in this space over these decades, and it's to complement the many important efforts underway in multiple UN fora, academia, IPLC networks, and elsewhere, and the topics that seek to address how biodiversity-based research and commercialization can contribute to conservation and equity. The program offers a space to pause and reconsider, to analyze and listen to ideas, often on the margins, and draw upon multiple disciplines and experiences to do this, as well as to think of generational shifts and to bring in younger critical voices and those who are involved actively in science, conservation, and development, but who may not be involved in ABS discussions. So how does the program work and what will we do? Well, the objectives are first to deepen understanding about the broader context within which ABS falls. Second, to re-examine assumptions about ABS in achieving the objectives of various international agreements. Third, to review the effectiveness of different approaches to achieve equity, social justice, and conservation. Fourth, to explore how biodiversity research and scientific partnerships can achieve these objectives. And finally, to support the development of policies that are practical, relevant, and can be implemented and to direct policy attention towards the most strategic areas for achieving conservation, social justice, and equity. We focus on 4 themes. The first theme is on science, biodiversity, and equity, where we explore how concepts of equity and ethics in science, relationships with conservation, and scientific collaborations have evolved over the last 30 years, and how we can reimagine benefits from science to align with a more inclusive agenda centered on decolonizing science and innovation that achieve structural change and social and environmental impact. In the second theme, we'll critically explore ABS governance and the legal ecosystem within which it exists at international, local, and national levels to understand the range of policy mechanisms that could be drawn upon to achieve human rights, equity, and conservation outcomes, the drivers of national ABS laws, including the role of donors, the intersection of ABS with community rights laws and practices, and some of the conceptual and practical implications of a model that shares benefits. The third theme looks at intersections of conservation, biodiversity use, and commercialization, the gains and losses of conservation from biodiversity research and commercial use, how ABS fits within the range of contemporary conservation strategies, and the new thinking and approaches that address power relations, inequality, poverty, social justice, the rights of nature, and multi-species approaches. And the final theme on development and post-growth examines models of development that underpin ABS, which began as one of many pro-growth strategies to achieve both conservation and development. We ask here about the limitations of approaches that involve benefit sharing without paying attention to power imbalances and inequities, and how we can think in more transformative ways about paradigms that de-emphasize scale and global markets, measure impact differently, and enable long overdue recognition for other ways of knowing and being. The program is made up of 2 phases, a 3-year dialogue, dissemination, and book production phase running over the next 3 years, followed by a 2-year dissemination and increased national and international policy engagement phase. It includes a set of ongoing dialogues across the 4 themes, workshops, policy briefs, a video series, a book, scientific and popular articles, as well as a synthesis module to effectively communicate key messages across thematic areas and through different media. And we also plan national level work, starting with a symposium in South Africa next year, to be followed by other countries as the program evolves. It's very much a collective exercise, working through active partnerships and collaboration with a wide range of groups, some of whom are listed here. And this includes a steering committee, a resource group, and diverse participants in ongoing dialogues. We encourage you to visit our website to find out more about the program, and would really welcome further engagements on these and other issues. And I include here just a set of references that might be useful if you wish to dig a little bit deeper into many of these issues. And I look forward to engaging with you now and hearing if you have any questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you ever so much. Please join me, everyone, in a virtual round of applause for our speaker. That was just fantastic. Thank you so much. Such an exhaustive historical overview of a history I know, or thought I knew, reasonably well, but now know a lot better. And thank you so much for sharing the work plan and prospect for the Rethinking Biodiversity project. The work that you have slated looks just absolutely fascinating, and I'm anticipating the results. I can't wait for them to come out. While people are organising their thoughts and questions in the chat, I have a question that I'd like to put to you for speakers with speakers prerogative. Oh yes, I just wanted to note as well that it was a slightly sad moment, and I can't help but agree that perhaps the thing that has been most thoroughly conserved is bureaucracy in this process. I wondered, in terms of the way that that bureaucracy has been instantiated in different countries, I think that pointing to the market-driven assumptions which underlie those national instantiations is absolutely the thing that holds coherence across many different countries' ABS regimes. Are there some examples you could point to and discuss which would highlight some variation? Are there any countries which have implemented ABS working off of collective, cooperative assumptions by contrast? Or is there variation within the types of market-driven assumptions and the ABS schemes which have flown from them? Thank you ever so much.
Yeah, thanks, Paris, for that question. It's an interesting one. And to be honest, I think what's emerged is a system that is, as I said, very much centered around compliance with Nagoya, which does, I think, set the legal frameworks into quite a rigid structure. So I don't, there's not a lot of space for creativity if one is wishing to comply with certain requirements under the Nagoya Protocol, which are linked to certificates of compliance and an entire machinery around that. But having said that, I do think that we're starting to learn lessons about how to be a little bit wiser in regulation, and to be, I think the main lesson that's coming through is to be light, to be as light as possible. And I know some countries are starting to develop legislation and thinking about that more carefully. I saw Anna I think on the group here from Mozambique. I know Mozambique are really thinking quite hard about how to do this in a different way. So maybe she has some comments. But certainly up to now, I think we've yet to see some very creative approaches that have emerged.
Thank you so much. If Anna's there and would like to jump in on the microphone, I think you can unmute yourself.
Hi, yes, good morning. Thank you. So I'm delighted to have a chance to listen in on this discussion. This is still very relevant for where we are in Mozambique. We are now towards, I would say, close to finalizing what will be a draft for circulation at a national level. And hopefully by the end of this year, we'll conclude this phase of development. It's already in Mozambique, there's quite a bit of bureaucracy that is complicated to navigate. And so the exercise of trying to be light feels very relevant. In the upcoming week, we'll have a chance to interface with academic entities from across the country, as well as different government offices, and the handful of private sector folks who are involved with research and technological development within the context of the bioprospecting conversation. There aren't very many here, which makes the conversation a bit amorphous for a lot of our stakeholders. But nonetheless, I'm glad to be part of these conversations at a larger level. And I think that Mozambique in some ways has an advantage to be able to learn from the ups and downs of the South African experience as our neighbor here in the region, and also from other entities like Brazil, who have tried to, over the course of the last 20 years, trial and then revise their regulatory platform. So for us now, it's a really interesting moment, and I'm very happy to have a chance to link into these wider conversations, because they will continue to be relevant for us.
Thank you so much, Anna, for jumping in such an impromptu way as well. Do you have a response on that point, Rachel? We've got a question in the chat if you'd like to move on to another one.
Sure, happy to move on.
Okay, so we've got a question from Rifki. Are you there, Rifki? Would you like to unmute and ask the question yourself?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for taking my question. I think I'd prefer to just ask one of my questions, which is specifically about the most recent COP on the Convention on Biodiversity. I understand wholeheartedly about all of these great research and study cases from South Africa about Indigenous knowledge. However, based on your observation about the recent benefit sharing mechanism of DSI, did you think that Indigenous knowledge took any part in its formulation in the latest COP? And do you think that with a better understanding about Indigenous knowledge, as well as Indigenous perspectives on resource utilization, can actually create a much better and more sustainable benefit sharing of DSI and biodiversity utilization? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Rifki. Yeah, I wasn't at the COP, but I mean, my understanding is that the whole space around the intersection between Indigenous knowledge and DSI still needs more work. I think there's an implicit recognition that, you know, much of our knowledge about biodiversity emerges from traditional knowledge. So, you know, there's an inextricable link between the two. But by the time sort of this is translated into the genetic sequences that are found on databases, it's very, very far removed from that knowledge, and it's almost impossible to trace back, which is, I think, one of the reasons why we have a multilateral mechanism rather than trying to do these bilateral arrangements, which historically have been quite problematic. And I think one of the motivations around the multilateral framework is that once and if money is generated, it would in some way, which I think is the million-dollar question, be directed back towards stewards of biodiversity and traditional knowledge holders, so that ultimately it would continue to support IPLCs. But I still think there's a lot of work that's needed to really untangle all of that in its various guises. Whether it can contribute, whether Indigenous knowledge can contribute to national laws or treaties, absolutely, and I think we've seen that it has. In many ways, you know, we have this sort of the situation around legal pluralism, where, you know, we have state laws and then often a parallel set of customary laws, which may or may not accord with national legislation. So, I mean, I think as importantly as Indigenous knowledge needs to inform national laws is the need to ensure that those customary laws remain strong. And how does one do that? Well, by not imposing land grabs, by strengthening security of communities over their land and their land rights, and by ensuring that those social systems remain intact. So I would say, you know, if one wants to invest energy, that's a much more important route. Although obviously one also wants to ensure that national laws are reflective of these cultural contexts as well. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Rifki. We've got 2 more questions in the chat, and hopefully we've got time for them. I'll ask Karen, if you're there, could you turn your microphone on, perhaps? Perhaps Karen won't be able to join us with a microphone, so I'll ask the question for her. The question is about cultivation conservation through cultivation. This idea has been part of the discussion. Do you think there is an opportunity for it to come back into this discussion?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, cultivation, it's a tricky one, because obviously cultivation is an important strategy to ensure that species that are in commercial trade are not overused. So from a conservation perspective, it's often punted as an important strategy, and it is. At the same time, what we often see with cultivation is that there's a shift in power dynamics and in beneficiaries, because to cultivate, you need capital, you need land, you need resources, which often the traditional harvesters of biodiversity don't have access to. So, and it, cultivation also upscales sort of the extent of operations. So we've seen this for many species, and it's been, I think Homer in the 1990s did some of that initial work just showing how things changed when one started cultivating, and then the shifts in benefits that took place. So I think conservation has to be thought through quite strategically. It can involve communities in commercial cultivation, but I mean, typically it does so not as co-owners, but it does so as sort of communities as laborers, which is, I think, not the kind of model that one would want to see in terms of promoting equity and social justice. So I think it's a complex question, and it needs to take into consideration, a whole range of factors, not only conservation.
Thank you so much, Karen, for the question. The chat has warmed up now. We've got two queued. So if Elizabeth is there, perhaps you would like to unmute and come into the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this talk and got a lot out of it. Thank you, Rachel. And I hope we can connect more. I think for me, the question that I had is regarding how to work with scientists who are really keen on especially all of this like genetic and genomic potential and possibilities. And that my experience is that even when they are very hopeful and interested in liaising with IPLCs, they have no experience with the literature, with the history, the background, the techniques and methods we have been engaging with, and as you said, over 30 years plus. So do you have any insights on how to work with the scientific community to kind of get them up to speed without sort of being rude about it, I guess, just to be blunt about it? Yeah.
No, that's a great question. Yeah. And I think it applies also to the ABS sort of framework and, the entire sort of machinery of ABS, because social science really hasn't featured very strongly at all. With no offense to the lawyers, but it is a field that is dominated by the legal profession in terms of disciplines. And then sort of the biotech and sort of biodiversity community, but I think social science has been left out, and we could really learn a lot more from bringing in, I think, much more of a multidisciplinary perspective, drawing on anthropologists, drawing on sociologists, and having wider teams to consider these issues. So it's also around the way our systems of education work, yeah, in that we are trained to be sort of very reductionist and narrow in how we address problems. And I mean, it is changing. I think the value of interdisciplinarity is starting to gather much more momentum now, which is really good. But I think the more we can start thinking about teams, because we, like industry, are now expected to negotiate benefit sharing agreements with communities. That's not what they're good at. And in the same way, I would say those in the bioengineering sector are not the right people to be thinking about how they should be engaging with IPLCs. We really need to draw on different skill sets, and not expect everyone to be experts in everything.
Yeah,
That
thank
would
you.
be my quick response.
There are several claps and thumbs up coming in agreement with you here, Rachel. One more question from Elsinore. Are you there, Elsinore? And would
Yes,
you like
I'm here.
to
Can
take
you
the
hear me?
microphone? Yes, we can.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Rachel, for very much your interesting talk. I enjoyed it very much. And I was just wondering if you, because you mentioned it earlier as well in your talk, if you could elaborate a bit more on the way that ABS relates to other mechanisms that are in place that try also to like enhance this equity in, well, biotrade or trade relations, and what ABS might bring that those other mechanisms might not, or Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think what ABS brings that the others don't right now is legislation. You know, it's a legislative framework, whereas things like benefit sharing sort of community agreements or corporate responsibility or some of the certification standards like Fair Wild are voluntary. You know, they're voluntary industry standards. So they don't have the weight that ABS has. So that really is, I think, the lever that it brings. But we're starting to see, I didn't mention it, but for example, in the Pelargonium case now, there's a Fair Wild standard that's been introduced, which also has a premium attached to it. And the communities that are being engaged with are the same communities that are being engaged with to develop ABS benefit sharing agreements. So it's leading to quite a lot of confusion and overlap because the communities are the same and the mechanisms are the same in terms of sort of distributing benefits. So I think more and more we're starting to see this overlap between the sort of legislative and voluntary standards, particularly now that ABS and biotrade are sort of becoming closer together. And it's an area that needs more work. You know, how can that synergy be most productive? You know, how can it be generative rather than debilitating? Yeah, I think there is a fair amount of work also to be done on really understanding what these voluntary standards, industry standards bring in terms of some of these wider systemic questions, because often they are sort of more about ensuring sort of human rights or looking at living wages, but not necessarily looking at systemic change around sort of the value chains, because they are industry driven. So they do have their restrictions because they are industry driven, as well as being voluntary.
Thanks very much. Great.
We've got one more question, if we can beg your time, please, Rachel. It follows on quite nicely from the last question. It's again about the complexity and the policy and legal ecology, if you like, around ABS. If Anna's there, would you like to turn your microphone on?
Yes, I actually think that this was partially answered in the last question, but I'm curious to know if there are efforts to look at how those voluntary standards are being analyzed in the context where ABS legislation is part of the same discussion, to look at how there might be mechanisms to create functional, I don't know, expectations, standards, models across the board within or for more unified aims. Right now, it seems a bit piecemeal. Every entity in its corner creating its own set of standards, with the potential for some confusing overlap, as you've mentioned. Are there efforts to look at this landscape of models in more holistic ways?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think you're spot on in saying that it is piecemeal. You know, it's often quite industry specific or species specific, so it's a hard call to try and bring that together. But it's an important thing to think about, and as far as I know, there isn't really anyone or any institution that is trying to look at this in a more holistic way and integrate it with ABS. But it is part of what we want to do with the Rethinking program. So I'm going to throw the invitation back to you, Anna, and say, please join these dialogues and start bringing, because you've got amazing experience in working across these different spaces, and to start bringing some of that into the discussion, to think about ways forward that can be sort of more integrative and holistic. Yeah, not a great answer, but
Yeah.
I think it's work
Thank
that's
you.
underway. Yeah.
I think, in terms of providing the analytic, overarching overview of the area, we're very much all now looking to rethinking biodiversity. So I think that's a nice place to end. I just want to pass on thanks and congratulations on the presentation from Kylie Lingard and Graham Duffield as well. And I think one thing that has come through very strongly in all of the talks in the series so far is that one of the key commodities here really is time. Time to think about these issues, time to explore and unpack ideas. And so I hope you will join me really in thanking Professor Wynberg for having shared her time with us so generously today. And I hope everybody will keep an eye on the Rethinking Biodiversity website and the People and Plants International website and the Bioeconomy Chair website to keep up with these ongoing projects, which I really think are going to radically change what's happening in the area. Thank you so much, Professor Wynberg.
Thank you so much, and thanks everybody. It was a great pleasure.